My name is Dr. Hosny El-Lakany. I'm adjunct professor at the Faculty of Forestry of the University of British Columbia. It's my pleasure to give this lecture today. The topic of our lecture today is Introduction to Global Forestry and Natural Resources Conservation Issues. What are the global forestry perspectives? I'll be talking about 4 points. First one, why forests are of global concerns. Why is everybody is concerned about forests? Second, the state of the world's forests. And third, the international forestry debate, the actors and the forums for debate. And then I will close with some summaries of the current and emerging issues in international forestry, especially as related to the topic that everybody is talking about now, forest and climate change. Well, to start with, why are forests of a global concern? Why is everybody in the world almost is concerned with the forest? First of all, because forests are transboundary, which means that they don't, forests when they spread on their coverage on the earth, they don't know bounds, they don't know borders, they don't know political borders. They are all over the world. And in the forest, we have people who can move across the borders in many, many countries. We have trade among countries. We have the climate change, which affects everybody. If there is a climate change or there is some global warming, it affects all the world. It does not stop at borders also. Another example is the water. Water sometimes originates in one country and ends up in several other countries. We can say the same about biodiversity. Biodiversity does not know borders. You cannot have a species stopping at the borders. They don't go through customs or immigration people, no. Biodiversity spreads all over the world. The same goes for fire. If there is a fire in a certain country, sometimes, most of the time, it crosses the borders as well. And if you are going to combat fire, stop fire, manage fire, you just cannot stop at the borders because it affects everybody. The same goes for pests. Insects, diseases do not know borders. So the forests are a global issue. Insects do not need a visa to cross borders, like many people. No? Same thing goes with the sovereign rights of nations to exploit their own resources, but with a global responsibilities. This is a very important issue in international forestry. Each country has sovereign rights over its resources. Nobody can come and tell certain country, we have to take your resources. Well, normally, nobody says that. But if any country has sovereign rights over its own resources, every country in the world almost is a global player. So they have to go by international law. And they have also responsibilities for that. Each country is responsible to properly or sustainably manage its own natural resources with a global responsibility within global agreements. And we will be touching on this pretty soon. Now, just to introduce this, I just want to share with you some information about the state of the world forest. This is a responsibility of an international organization called the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, which I had the honor of heading the forestry department for 8 years. Each 5 years, this organization produces what is known as the State of the World Forest, where the professionals of this organization, in collaboration with many countries, or actually 192 countries around the world, they collaborate in producing data and information about the state of the world forest. And these are put together in a publication that would be available to everybody in the world to look at what's happening in the forest in the world. And in the last, say, 20 years, it was produced like something like 1990, 95, 2000, 2005, and 2010. Some of the information produced in this State of the World or State of the World Forest 2010, we can extract some very basic information about the forest in the world. For example, the forests cover, the forest in general, and this is globally, they cover about 4.1 billion hectares. This represents almost 1/3, or exactly about 31% of the total land area of the globe. So for every 3 square kilometers on Earth, there is one square kilometer covered with forest. If you take this as per capita, world average, each person on this Earth is allocated, theoretically of course, 0.6 hectare of forest. If you take this in Canada, this will be very, very high, because in Canada we have few people and a very large area of forest. In China, there is a very large area of forest, but there are a lot of people as well. So per capita in China is far less than that. Per capita on the average in Canada, in Europe is much higher. Just to give an example. Now, according to the State of the World Forest, again, in 2010, about 90% of the forest area is naturally regenerated, which means that when the trees are cut, and about 90% of the forest, globally, when the trees are cut or die or damaged for one reason or another, there is a 90% of the area of natural forest regenerate by itself without interference of people, because they drop the seeds germinate in certain conditions and regenerate the forest. Also, about little over 1/3 of the total forest area of the primary forest are composed of native species, which means they are the original species on the same site. They are not what we call exotic or introduced species. And when we say that they are primary forest, this means that there is no human intervention, which means there is no logging, legal or illegal, or intervention to a scale that would change the state of the forest. Where are the forests in the world? This is the world map. When you have the green, dark green, this is where the forests in the world are. You can tell in the tropics, in the north, Southeast Asia, for example, Australia, in the boreal areas, in the temperate areas. So forests are spread practically all over the world except in the very dry tropics. In the center, as you can see, parts of North America, parts of Latin America, large parts of North Africa, and Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East, of course, or most of the Middle East, as well as very large area of Australia void of trees. You can also tell that the trees follow the moisture more or less and the temperature. Now, who owns the forest? Where are the forests in the world? As I say, they are spread practically all over the world, but there are 5 major countries, or 5 countries in the world that own about a little bit more than 50% of the forest in the world. Like, you have almost 200 countries in the world. 5 of them own 50% of the forest area. And the other 195, they own the other 50%. So you can tell that the forest area, the forest cover in the world is unevenly distributed among the countries of the world. The 5 countries who own the majority or 50% of the world forests are starting with the Russian Federation. In the Russian Federation, out of the 4 billion hectares of forest in the world, the Russian Federation owns, or there are forest cover in the Russian Federation. I don't know if they own it or not, but the forest cover in the Russian Federation is about 22%. In other words, just about 1/4 of the forest area in the world is found in the Russian Federation. The other part of the world where there's a lot of forest, or the other country, is Brazil in the tropics. We know the Amazon Basin, one of the largest forest areas in the world. Brazil is second highest, followed by Canada and the US, which are almost the same, about 10% each. And China. Also, a lot of people don't think of China as a very large forest area in the world. It is. It is the 5th largest forest area in the world. And here I'm talking about forest cover in general, not only the natural forest, but planted forest as well. Because China, as we will see later on, has one of the highest rate of reforestation in the world, which means that they replant the trees. Now, we have, as I said, the natural forests, the planted forests, but what's happening in the forest in general? Why are we so worried about the forest? Actually, the rate of deforestation, when you remove the forest, and we'll say soon how do we remove the forest and why. When you remove the forest, when you change a piece of land from a forest to something else which is not a forest, we call this deforestation, which means that we change the status of the forest from a forest to something else. Sometimes we call it conversion, but conversion is specific to converting the forest to something like agriculture. But deforestation is so general. That means that you change the state of the forest from a forest, whether it's planted or natural, to non-forest. That is deforestation. If you look at the deforestation between the year 2000 and 2010, we find that on the average, annually, the world loses 13 million hectares of forest, which is converted to some other land use, mostly agriculture. So every year, the average in the world average of deforestation is about 13 million hectares, or little over 1 million hectares every day. Every month. The world loses about 1 million hectares of forest every month. That's a lot of forest. So either they are converted to some other land use like agriculture, or they are lost to natural causes, sometimes like fire and insect. But when the world loses forest through deforestation, removal of the forest, some countries replant the forest. So we look at the net loss. You have deforestation, forest converted to something else, but in the same time you have some countries, like China for example, they plant a lot of forest. When we look at the net loss of the forest area in the world, it's about 5.2 million hectares per year. So we lose a total of about 13, we gain about 5, we gain about 8, so the net loss is about 5. If you look at the succession of forest loss over the last, say, 20 years or so, It used to be in the last decade, between 1990 and 2000, it used to be about 8.3 million hectares. In the just past decade, from 2000 to 2010, it went down to 5.2, which means that there is either reduction in the rate of deforestation or an increase in the rate of reforestation, or both, because that's why we went down from a net loss of 8 to a net loss of 5. And you can see in the pictures some of the very drastic examples of deforestation in the world. On the right, you can see some of the hilly lands, where you see the roads made for, this is in Latin America. This picture's from Latin America on the right. The hilly side, the roads were built on the top, and complete deforestation. On the left-hand side, this is in Indonesia, in Kalimantan, where you see the deforestation. You can see the forest in the background, but you can see also how drastic the deforestation in the peatland. This is peat. And what they do, they dig a canal, small canals across the land, and then a big one to drain the peat, and then use the boats to ship the timber. That's very drastic. Not only because the timber is lost, the wood is lost, the forest is deforested, but most important is that this peatland contains a huge amount of carbon. Once you deforest this part of Indonesia, this is in Indonesia and many other parts of the world like this, you release carbon in the atmosphere, and eventually you contribute to global warming. But you can see the wealth of timber extracted from this area. Most likely this area will be going into either oil palms or soybean. Most likely oil palms. Now, this is in Brazil. Although we said that the rate of deforestation and the rate of forest loss is decreasing with time, it is very, very alarming. We cannot afford, as a world, we cannot afford to lose this huge amount of forest, especially natural forest. But, as I said, most of the loss is conversion to agriculture. And mostly, like you see on the lower right-hand corner, this forest was cut, and you can see the very small tractors there plowing the soil, preparing it for soybean in Brazil. Of course, China is one of the main users of soybean in the world. The other thing is that beside agriculture, normal crops like soybean or oil palm, there is a lot of animal production. There is a lot of cows and raised around the world to supply meat to the world. And that's one of the main drivers of deforestation in Latin America, cattle production. You must have heard that the world now, many people in the world now are increasing their consumption of meat around the world. If this materializes, some people expect by even as soon as 2015, in 4 years' time, there will be an increase of about 300 million people around the world demanding to increase their meat consumption by between 5 and 10 folds. So can you imagine where is this meat is coming from? It will come from Brazil, Argentina, and many similar countries around the world. And where would the land come from? Naturally, it will be the conversion of the forest to pasture and agricultural land. Again, this is related to my first point, which is forests are a global concern. What happens in Brazil, for example, what happens in the Congo Basin, what happens in China to the forest, affects almost everybody in the world. The other thing is unsustainable logging. You see this picture that I took in Papua New Guinea, where the forests, some of the best forests in the world, are illegally logged, which means that it's done outside the law. Like because of some corruption, because of some many other things, big companies, they come and cut the forest illegally without a plan, and most of the time they don't pay the government much, or at least they don't pay legally. Maybe they are paying illegally. But that's also a very, very serious hazard to the forest. And as soon as these logs are prepared, they are shipped immediately outside of the country. And I think we know some of the countries who are importing most of these illegal logs. The other thing that the people do, and mostly in the dry tropics, this is in Africa, parts of Kenya, where people depend on firewood for cooking, for heating water, for sometimes heating, space heating, and so on. On the average, about 55% of the wood cut in the world goes to fuel wood, which means that if of every 2 cubic meters or every 2 tons of wood cut, 1 goes to fuel wood. This ratio in Africa, it can go up to 90%. So in other words, 90% of the wood harvested in Africa, especially dry Africa, the dry tropics, sub-Saharan Africa, I'm not talking mainly about the Central Africa or the Congo Basin, but in sub-Saharan Africa, dry parts, about 90% of the energy comes from wood. And this you can see in the Sudan, southern Sudan, where the wood is harvested. This is mostly acacia, and it's sold in the market for fuel wood. It's a huge amount. Mostly it's made into charcoal. The other cause of deforestation around the world is mining, especially this destructive mining where they clear the forest and mine what's underground. And this is again in Latin America, where these mining companies, they just wipe out, they remove the forest completely to do the mining. Some of them now are trying to reforest the area, but this is the way it looks in many parts of the world. Another effect of deforestation or removal of the forest is what is known as desertification. Desertification means changing the land from productive land, whether agriculture, forest, or whatever, into a desert, which means it's non-productive. This is a photo taken in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in a sandstorm, and you can see there is nothing on the ground, few trees of acacia here and there, but that is not much. So when you remove the forest in the dry areas, desertification follows. The land becomes completely, or well, almost completely unproductive. This is followed by drought, collection of firewood, and sometimes animal grazing, especially goats. Then you turn the area into complete desert. And this desert is growing all over the world. China is a very good example of this, although China, they are doing a very good work trying to arrest the desert by planting trees and other methods. Also, one of the major losses around the world is biodiversity, especially the wildlife. And so many species have been extinct because of the removal of the forest. If some species live in the forest, if some animals, plants live in the forest, and then when you remove the forest, these creatures disappear. They don't have a way to living. They cannot go and live in the nearby village, or they live in a house. they have to live in the forest. Now, what do we do about this globally again? Many countries, after, like you see in the picture here, after they log the forest, they do what is called slash and burn. They burn all the debris or the leftover material, which is a bad practice, by the way, and they replant the trees. This is Acacia mangum planted in parts of Malaysia. So this is afforestation, which means planting trees on an area that it was not forest before, at least in the immediate past. Like, say, 100 years ago, and this is happening in North America a lot, and in Australia, the trees the soil or the land was converted from forest production or from productive forest into agriculture. And then for some reason, either drought or the economy is not right, these lands are deserted. They are not using it anymore, so it is converted into forest by a process called afforestation. When you start a forest new. On the other side, you have reforestation, which means that it was a forest in the immediate past, and then it is reforested, you plant it again, or let it grow naturally. This expansion in the forested area, whether it's new or reforestation, whether it's afforestation or reforestation, reduces the net loss of the forest. And this is happening in many parts of the world. You can see from this picture how difficult it is to grow forests or trees in a very dry area. Many people are used to rain, to kind of water the young plants. But in this case with acacia, with prosopis in the background, or mesquite as it is known, the people who live in these villages, they irrigate it one by one, which is very, very difficult job. But trees for these people who live in the dry areas are vital for their survival. And that's why they go onto all these hardship to plant trees. On the other hand, you have areas which are given a very good environment for growing trees. This picture is in Brazil, and what you see there is not corn or wheat, it's eucalyptus trees, about 6 years old, 7 years old. And it's grown, you can see also on the foreground when they are harvested, the small logs. It is going mainly for ethanol production and charcoal for industry. But these huge areas now represent, on a global scale, 7% of the forest cover. So out of the 4 billion hectares that we have in the world in 2010, about 7% are from planted forest, which means that either it was a forest before or it was not a forest before, but it was replanted with trees. And these plantations that you see in the picture here, these are industrial plantation. They are not planted just because people love the forest. Of course, the people love the forest, but this is mainly for industrial uses. As I said, the logs are used industrially. Now, one of the major topics now is related to climate change, forest and climate change. That's what everybody is talking about in the world. Well, forests are a huge store of carbon in the world. There are about 650 billion tons of carbon stored in the forest in the world. That's about 44% in the forest biomass, which means the leaves and branches and the stems. About 11% in the dead wood on the forest floor and the litter. And about 45% of this huge amount of carbon is stored in the forest soil. That's why if we burn the forest, if we log the forest, we lose a lot of this carbon from the soil. The recent study showed that the carbon stock in the forest biomass decreased by about half gigaton annually between 2005 and 2010. So there is a decrease because of the deforestation. The carbon stored in the forest is decreasing. But because of all of this deforestation, if you look at the contribution of deforestation to the global emission of carbon, because when you burn the forest, when you have industry, for example, burning coal, you actually release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's why we have the global warming. Yeah? But forests, the deforestation, all the forest operations that we see around the world contribute between 17 and 20% of what we call greenhouse gas emissions. This is a collective name for carbon dioxide and a few other gases that when they are released into the atmosphere, they kind of change the atmosphere, becomes warmer. That's why we call it global warming. And that's why it is important to talk about the contribution of forests to global warming globally. And what can we do as foresters to mitigate this or reduce this drastic effect? This graph was produced for the IPCC. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that shows the contribution of forests to the total greenhouse gas emissions in the world. If you look at the gray color, this is the fossil fuel. When you generate electricity using charcoal, coal, for example, this is what happens. When you burn a diesel, that's what happens. Deforestation is the kind of orange. It's about less than 1/5 or 1/4. And down there, the brown, this is the other sources of pollution. Now, let me just touch on some very important issue that people are talking about now. That is related to what is known as REDD, R-E-D-D+. This is the term used now all over the world for reduced emission. That's about the greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide. Reduced emission, that's RE, from deforestation, the first D, and forest degradation, the second D. Reduced emission from deforestation and forest degradation. This plus means that this includes conservation of forest, sustainable forest management, and stock enhancement. As I say, this is the term now used internationally, especially in the negotiation of the climate change. The last session was last November, December in Cancun, Mexico. Before that was in Copenhagen and so on. This is where the countries around the world get together and negotiate about the climate. What can we do about the climate change? Forestry plays a very important role there. So that's why they came with this terminology. REDD, reduced emission from deforestation and forest degradation, including conservation, sustainable forest management, and stock enhancement. Now, why are we talking about this internationally? Okay. In 2005, FAO, the organization I used to work for, produced State of the World Forest and said that the rate of deforestation in the world is about 13 million hectares annually. And of course, deforestation contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, either by burning the forest or other misuse. Somebody got hold of this figure of 13 million hectares of deforestation and did some calculation and said this contributes, as I said, between 17 and 20% of the total global emission of greenhouse gases. A third person or a third group took this figure and said, okay, if we want to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, or if we want to mitigate the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we should or we must stop deforestation. Okay? Because forests contribute about 20%, so let's stop deforestation. Of course, this is, sounds very good. Even the very famous economist, Lord Stern, did all these calculations, but he is an economist. His knowledge about forest was not as let's say, concrete as his economics. It's not as simple as this. It's you just cannot go and tell the people stop deforestation. We give you an order because people live on the forest. They live out of the forest. So it's very important. So on one side, there is a lot of efforts to encourage countries, especially the major deforesters, to reduce deforestation. On the other side, some people say, let's restore the degraded forest, let's rehabilitate the degraded land, and this is the best way to reduce greenhouse gases, both economically, because you will give the people work, environmentally, it's good to plant more trees, and socially, because the people will be engaged in this. That's why there is a lot of focus now on this plus in the red. See red on the top there, red plus, this plus, which is restoration of degraded forest, planting more trees. In other words, enhancing the carbon stock. Will increase the carbon stock in the forest. But when we plant forest, it's not only because we want to capture the carbon. No, this is just one. That's what the environmentalists say. People from the environment, pure environment, say plant forest to capture carbon. We say, in addition to capturing carbon, there are other benefits for the forest. There is a lot of biodiversity there. There is a lot of water management. There is a lot of fuel wood, for example, many additional benefits for planting the forest. Who is talking about this? This is the third topic. Who is talking about where are all these discussions internationally taking place? There are many international organizations dealing with forest debate or forest policy. The first and the oldest of them is the Food and Agriculture Organization of FAO, which is with headquarters in Rome, Italy, and they have country offices practically all over the world. The Forestry Department is part of this organization where most of these statistics are originating. The other body that is discussing forest internationally, it is called the United Nations Forum on Forests, or UNFF. This is located in the United Nations headquarters in New York, and this is where most of the international discussions, like the legally binding instrument, non-legally binding, and so on, all the global forest policy issues are discussed in New York, and sometimes they have this forum has its sessions in Geneva, Switzerland, where the UN European headquarters. It used to be every year where the countries come together and discuss. Now it's every 2 years. The third major player in forestry and internationally is the World Bank, of course. And just for your information, a lot of people think of the World Bank as a source of fund, which is true. A World Bank is some fund, some projects around the world, but after all, it's a bank, which means that the main concern is investment, like they lend people money, different countries money, so they can make interest. But there are some money going almost free to many developing countries from the World Bank, and the bank has very significant interest in global warming and climate change through forestry and others. There is the what is known as the Forest Carbon Partnership and the Forest Investment Fund. They are located in the World Bank to deal with forest and climate change. The fourth organization, international organization, is the Center for International Forest Research, or C4 for short. And this is located, the headquarters is in Bogor, Indonesia. I have the honor to chair the board of trustees of this organization. And this is where we do a lot of work, mainly from the research side, to deal with global issues. Most important now, we're talking about forest and climate change and forest and water. There are quite a few projects around the world, including China and many other parts of the world. The fifth organization is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. This is where the climate change is discussed almost every year, and this is the most influential group in the world. They meet around the world to discuss what can the world do about the climate change, and forests play a very important role in this collection. These are the international organizations, intergovernmental, which means that governments are members of these. On the other side, you have non-governmental organizations. Very, very important, very influential, such as the WWF, World Wildlife Funds, and they have a very strong program on forest and climate change. The civil society, other members of the society, they are quite influential, like the private industry. Industry has interest, of course, in global forestry, because whatever the countries decide about the forest, removing the forest or planting forest or whatever, it affects the industry. The forest owners also are affected by this international forest debate. The scientific communities, all the researchers, the academics, people at the university like ours and yours, where people are concerned about climate change and they look at forestry side. In addition to that, you have the indigenous people. In Canada, we call them the First Nation. In many countries, they are forest dwellers. These people who lived in the forest practically all their lives, and they have, of course, a vested interest in the welfare of the forest. The youth, also, it's a new emerging group with a lot of interest in what's happening in the forest, and women group as well. This civil society, these different groups of civil societies are invited quite frequently to attend as observers in the international debate. So when there is a meeting at, for example, at the UNFF or even on the climate change, the organizers invite these groups to participate as observers, which means they don't vote, but they can influence the discussion. This practice is only in the last, say, 15, 20 years, because these groups felt that they were excluded. And this process of discussing international forestry has to be inclusive, where everybody should be sitting there, although may not be around the table. Just in summary, when the international forestry or the countries come together with the civil society to discuss forest, what are we discussing most of the time? We all discuss the sustainable forest management, how to manage the forest for today and for tomorrow. That's putting it in a simple way. The issues under discussion in the past 15, 20 years and still continuing are forest and climate change, as I said, that's important. Illegal forest activities, illegal logging. Forest law enforcement, because so many countries, they don't have law enforcement in their countries. Logging bans, that's famous in China. After, in the late 90s, when there was this torrential rains and floods and landslide, there was a decision by the Chinese government to stop logging. They call it the logging ban. But when you look at the statistics, you wonder if there is no logging in China, where does the log come from? This is a different subject, but it's mostly from outside China. The fourth issue is the trade in forest products, including the trade in carbon. That's an emerging market now, where you can sell the carbon in the forest. Forest certification, and this is now, again, it's becoming a trend in many countries around the world to certify their forest. Land tenure, and there is a big debate, I know, in China now about land tenure, especially agricultural land and forest. In many areas of China, the land was given back to the people, but the tenureship is still a very debatable issue, especially for indigenous people and forest communities. The seventh issue under discussion globally is the forest and conflicts. And that's important because recently there was some statistics about the conflicts, fights, wars in the forest. About 28% of the wars in the world are happening in the forest, and this affects the forest drastically. And finally, forest and poverty reduction. Poverty is a global issue, as much as forestry, as much as climate, even more serious than climate, some people think. There are about 1.3 billion, that's 1,300 million people around the world, they live under $1 a day. That's the poverty line. That's people, they cannot really survive, but they are surviving somehow. But the poverty reduction, poverty alleviation is a major issue in the world now. And forests have to play a very important role because a very big, very large percentage of these people who are under the poverty line, they live in the forest. So that's why we have to worry about that. And this is finally just a photo, again taken in Papua New Guinea, which is close to Australia, to show that the people, that's what I meant by poverty reduction. These logs in the background there, they worth hundreds, thousands of dollars. And this is going mainly to the concessionaires, to the companies, legally and illegally. They log, sell the logs, they may pay stumpage or legal fees for the government, but most of the time it's illegal. And the poor people on the foreground, they just watch. They don't get some of this money. Thank you.